So supposedly caucuses are biased against her and they favor Bernie Sanders. Now, Richard, you're in a caucus state, so maybe you can weigh in on what you think about this. But I mean, that argument doesn't muster when the first two caucuses he lost. I mean, maybe that just means people learned the lessons from some of the issues that arose in Iowa and Nevada and were more organized, right? And made sure, I think Bernie volunteers do better with making sure they're organized, engaged, and involved, at that level. And it takes a lot of commitment to stay there and be active. I don't know. I haven't caucused before, but I know Richard.
Yeah, no. Uh, I went into it in a little bit more detail on tonight on Project Sanity, so if people want more information, they can go there. But just to give some kind of stuff around the caucus process and what Nick was mentioning about being open and who pays for it. Excuse me. Washington just had the primary, which people saw in the news recently. That is paid for by the state. The caucus is paid for by the party, and that's just for ours particularly, and that's usually kind of how it breaks down in most states, that if they have a primary, it's funded by the state, and then it's also subject to many of the voter regulations and rules that they have. And then caucuses are usually party events, and so then the rules and so forth are determined by the party rather than a state's voting rules. And so in that way, that's why caucuses are actually open. And we saw Republican caucuses that functioned a little bit differently, where it was essentially like a primary, but then there was also like a side room that if you wanted to, you could go in and either try and convince other people to vote your way or be convinced to vote for a certain candidate. I think that is actually probably the model that I think would satisfy people that like caucuses and primaries the most. And then I think you could get state funding, and then you could also make that an open process so that anybody could come in, basically go to that room and figure out which side they want to vote for, who they want to vote for, and it would serve the engagement process that the whole nomination process was actually.
Right.
Typically, though,
go ahead.
When they have a primary and a caucus in the same state, the caucus is primarily to elect delegates that go to the convention, right? And that's why that's a different matter. The actual delegates that are going to go to the convention, I'm okay with you having to have a registered Democrat or whatever go to the convention or whatnot. My point is
that's the same thing with that's how our primaries work. Our primaries we vote and then we send delegates to convention.
No.
That because Bernie won the caucus, but a week ago or a few days ago they had the Washington State primary, and Hillary Clinton won. They used that in that article to show that Hillary Clinton has an advantage in primaries and Bernie just wins caucuses. And it's just going into a rant here. They're not using numbers the way they did 4 years ago. Maybe it's because people expect more 538 and Nate Silver now. They expect them to make predictions earlier, and you don't have as good data earlier than you would have if you just waited for more data to come in. But in place of the lack of data that they have, they're just using punditry. The same punditry that they ranted about last cycle, that pundits are dumb, they just go by their gut feelings and they go by the instincts, and they don't have data to back up their arguments. They're just doing that themselves now. Nate Silver just tweeted out a few hours ago that if every state was an open primary with same-day registration, Hillary Clinton would win, and win larger than she is now. He said
it's so ridiculous considering.
Hold on, let me back it up before we get on that one, though. I was going to say, what I was talking about with the primary is that when you have both a primary and a caucus, the caucus is for the delegates, but the primary is still paid for by the state. That's what I was saying. If it's paid for by the state, then it should be open to everybody.
But the primary doesn't count, so it doesn't matter. If you have a caucus and a primary in a state, right? So Washington, the primary, why they're voting again for those candidates in the primary, I don't know, Richard, if you have anything to share on that, but it doesn't count for anything.
Yeah, it doesn't. How it works is that because of how the party was set up, it was a mostly internal decision, but there was the Democratic and Republican Party that were involved in deciding how we were going to do our elections this year, and it was possible that we were just going to do everything on a primary, or that both sides were going to hold caucuses. Republicans opted against the caucus, so that meant we were going to have a primary, and Democrats still wanted to hold on to the caucus, and so in order to do that, the Republicans still had to have the primary ballot, but the Democratic Party required that the Democratic names go out on the ballot also, and so they sent out all of these primary ballots to people that registered Democrat, voted Democrat, participated in the caucus, or just didn't at all, which to me is one of the issues I have, is about while we're paying for it and while we're funding it,
that's
why
what
are
I
we
assumed
sending
it was, because it was like
it's not going to count.
Donald Trump had a primary and that one was scheduled, but then like there was this other secret Democratic primary, even though the caucus already happened. So I assumed it was like, oh, they're apparent for some reason they just had Democratic names on this Republican primary ballot, for some odd reason. But yeah.
Okay, so that might be something in particular with that particular state, because that's not how it works down here. Like, that actual primary decides the actual number of delegates, and the caucus is just which delegates actually go, but the number doesn't change.
Yeah, and that's part of the mess, is that we have such different things.
That's a hodgepodge then.
Even when we use the same words, they mean different things in different states.
Definitely. Even just looking at the different ones, like I just can't even keep up with the different caucuses and how they're just various differences across the board. It'd be great if we had a little more uniformity, but hey, this wouldn't be the good old USA if we were uniform about anything. So, okay, so the room wants to hear about...
One last thing. I just want to say as a final rant, Nate Silver, if you really think that if there was an actual primary instead of a caucus and Hillary Clinton would win that caucus, if you think that if every state was an open primary with same-day registration, that Bernie would not have won by large margins Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, Massachusetts, and New York, I have a very large bridge in the deserts of New Mexico I'd like to sell you, because that makes no sense. And there is no way you can prove with data that if there was an open primary in every state in the Democratic primary process, that Bernie would lose by larger margins than he is now. That is hilarious.
Part of the problem with that, too, is it disregards the fact that the caucus happened. So everyone who had been organizing, the caucus happened. The delegates, you guys have had your convention in Washington, right, Richard?
Oh, well, we had county conventions, and then
the county conventions. You've had your county conventions, right?
Congressional CD caucuses where we picked the delegates to send. So everybody this week had just basically checked out.
So you've had all these layers of the process, especially if we're talking about a lot of people are new voters, right, or they haven't really been engaged in the process before. People are probably like, what do you mean we vote? It's confusing, but it doesn't count. So Nate Silver and everybody else, that's not proof of anything, because we have your media blackout. You don't have people, actively getting out the vote. There are all these other factors that go into it that just be straight random numbers that they try to pull out and just don't muster up to. So, moving on. The room wants to talk about debate.
Before we move on, I'm going to say,
debate.
Come on, let me give one comment in on. We'll get to the debate. I was going to say, it is my opinion that based off of other measures and with all the suppression and possible election fraud that's been going on, that even with the closed primary system, he's likely only 50 or so delegates behind Hillary Clinton. So trying to base any of these results as like it's some sort of referendum or something that you can really have a real analysis on as a real representation of how people have voted, with the results being, what they are, is spurious at best. It's not a good argument. I think that he should just throw all that stuff away. And then, based on his own data that he does have, he makes conclusions that don't make any sense either. When we see Bernie Sanders winning independents by 70 and 80%, but somehow if it's open primary, he would not win these independents and somehow lose these independents, and Hillary, who's doing much worse than him, is somehow going to do much better.
Remember, they're not true independents.
Oh yeah, that not true independent was garbage.
Yeah.